Well, it looks like Nicolas Maduro may be finally on his way out in Venezuela, and it's no thanks to the likes of Elliott Abrams, Donald Trump, John Bolton, or any of the rest of those clowns. Reuters is reporting that there were some secret negotiations going on this week between opposition and government representatives. Representatives of both parties this week apparently flew to Norway, which apparently had a bit to do with the peace negotiations in Colombia regarding the government there and the FARC rebels. Now, the opposition and Maduro's government did not meet directly with one another, but rather with the Norwegian mediators to try and make their case. Maduro alluded to this in a speech this week when he said that the Minister of Information was out of the country and on a very important mission. Now, it's very positive that we're seeing dialogue between Maduro and people outside his party about some kind of a transitional government. Now, from what we're hearing, this transition period would not include Maduro. He would immediately resign, but he would likely have some kind of ally put in his place during the transition period. And I would assume after that, the plan would be for them to have fresh elections. I'm very glad to see the Venezuelans themselves trying to solve this without any kind of conflict, because it's pretty clear that the likes of John Bolton and Elliott Abrams would not be all that unhappy were a civil war to break out in Venezuela. And of course, as an American, I fear that more than anything, because that would give us essentially a Syria on our continent. It would no doubt send millions of refugees north through the southern border of the U.S., not to mention leading to thousands of meaningless deaths. However, if I had to guess, the folks in Washington are not going to be all too happy about these peace talks, and certainly wouldn't want them to succeed. Because the problem with Maduro is not simply in the eyes of Washington that they think he stole some election or something. I mean, Washington supports plenty of governments that aren't elected. The problem here is that Maduro is not loyal to the United States. In fact, he considers himself to be somewhat of an adversary. Of course, there's not much he can do to hurt the U.S. And it's very clear that the purpose of U.S. involvement in Venezuela is to make sure that someone like Juan Guaido, who is educated in the United States, he went to George Washington University, and is loyal to the United States government. In fact, he went through a youth program that's very similar to what the State Department, or was it the CIA, one of the two, what they ran in Serbia, as far as educating young leaders to try and overthrow Milosevic, who of course was a friend of Russia. So if I had to guess, even if the opposition and the Venezuelan government come to some kind of agreement and agree to this transition period, I don't think that the U.S. will recognize it one bit. Because Guaido and his ilk, considering that they are actively trying to overthrow the government, are not being included in these talks. What we're witnessing here, to me, looks an awful lot like the negotiations between the Rhodesian Front Party in the late 1970s and the moderate black opposition who participated in government. Now, for those of you who are unfamiliar with the Rhodesian Bush War, essentially you had three groups of black opposition parties who were not the part of the Rhodesian government. You had two groups, ZANU and ZAPU, which were actively fighting to overthrow the government, and then you had another faction led by Bishop Abel Musvarewa, who actually participated in elections and became the prime minister. And this, of course, was after negotiations, peaceful talks with the ruling party. Now, the rest of the world decided to recognize the violent rebels, the actual communist-backed leaders, Robert Mugabe and Joshua Nkomo, and so the agreement made between the opposition, the moderate opposition, and the whites in Rhodesia was essentially thrown out by the British, and they essentially installed Robert Mugabe. Now, my guess is that if the Venezuelans come to a similar agreement where you have moderate opposition folks who are not looking to overthrow Maduro currently, at least not through violent means, they're not calling for a coup or for a U.S. invasion, those folks will probably be considered illegitimate by the United States. But considering that the U.S. really hasn't had enough force to overthrow Maduro currently, if Maduro decides to hand off the baton to some moderate opposition party, would the U.S. then have even less impetus to overthrow that government? My guess is the answer would be yes. The U.S. probably would still have to recognize Guaido to save face, but they probably would ignore him and kind of send him into exile in Washington. And Venezuela would probably go about its business, and maybe in another 10 years you'll have a U.S. president who goes down to Caracas and makes peace with them and says, yeah, that was all a big misunderstanding, and it was stupid. Because really, this whole, the U.S.'s whole policy, or I should say John Bolton's policy in Venezuela, has been a total failure. It seems very clear to me that Trump was convinced by Bolton and Pompeo that, hey, if we just recognize this Guaido guy, all the military folks will switch sides and overthrow Maduro, and it'll be easy. They gave him the old, we will be greeted as liberators talk. But it turns out that the U.S. was not greeted as liberators. They were greeted as meddlers, and that did nothing but to strengthen Maduro's own position within his country. He was able to blame all of his problems in the country, not on his own policies, but on the meddling of the U.S. He could blame the economic problems on the sanctions. He could justify oppressing protesters by saying that they were nothing but American puppets and that he was preventing another Iran 1953-style coup. And on April the 30th, it seems that he was, somewhat vindicated on that front, even though I don't think the coup ever had any chance of succeeding. And it seems that coup that was attempted by Juan Guaido, which failed so spectacularly, that emboldened the military greatly to never leave Maduro's side, according to Reuters. And in fact, they apparently had already hammered out a transition agreement between Maduro and some of the opposition parties, of course not including Guaido. But after that attempted coup, Maduro completely scrapped the plan and said, no, we're not doing this now. So it would seem to me that U.S. meddling in Venezuela has only lengthened Maduro's term in office. Meanwhile, the U.S. is still trying to get the Code Pink protesters out of the Venezuelan embassy. And Juan Guaido himself is sending representatives to the U.S. to, again, as he keeps doing, as he's done really since February, repeatedly request for military intervention from the U.S., which, frankly, I don't see it happening right now. And that is ultimately a good thing for Venezuela, because no matter how bad things are right now, which they seem like they've been pretty bad, in my opinion, at least since the 80s, I think I heard a stat that if you're a Venezuelan millennial, you've never lived through a year of single-digit inflation. It's all been double-digit or higher. And so that's not an environment you can see it in. Venezuela's problems have gotten worse and worse over the last 20 years, but they ultimately predate, by a long shot, Chavez and Maduro. This has been going on for a long time, and really the whole political class in Venezuela is pretty much bankrupt ideologically as far as I'm concerned. And no civil war in Venezuela is going to change that. It's only going to get people killed, but the end result will still be social democrats or socialists. You're not going to have any market-oriented folks in office. Venezuela is fundamentally an anti-capitalist society, and we can't change that just through a simple coup d'etat. So I'll keep an eye on this, and I'll try to do a video updating on Libya, but I haven't seen a ton of news coming out of there, but I'll have to find something, because I'm sure that there has to have been some progress been made in the campaign in Tripoli. So anyway, stay tuned for tomorrow's video and for the day after that, because I do upload every day. And if you got anything of value out of this video, I'd appreciate you clicking that like button and subscribing. And if you do subscribe, click the bell, because I try to get a video out every morning. So I'll see you folks back here tomorrow.